Rain hammered the roof in a steady fury, the storm tearing across the plains like a herd of ghosts. Inside the barn, I moved through the shadows, a man made of silence. The lantern in my hand was my only friend, its light pushing back a darkness that lived deeper than just the night. At 40 years old, my life wasn't measured in days or dollars. It was measured in the cold ache of solitude, my hands worn from leather reins and splintered tools, never from the softness of another person's touch. I'd accepted it. The quiet was my inheritance. But tonight the storm carried a sound that wasn't thunder. It was a fist, a small, frantic fist, pounding against the massive barn door. I froze, my heart kicking against my ribs like a trapped bird. Lightning split the sky, a brilliant, terrifying crack of white, and in that instant I saw her, a silhouette pressed against the weathered wood, her hair a wild mess plastered to her face, her dress torn by the wind and the rain. "Please," she cried out, her voice raw, almost stolen by the howl of the storm. "Let me in." My feet felt rooted to the dirt floor. Visitors didn't come here, ever. The path to my ranch was a forgotten trail, and folks in town had long since decided I was better left alone, a ghost on the edge of the world. But that sound, that desperate plea, it wasn't a voice you could ignore. I hooked the lantern onto a beam, the metal groaning in protest. My boots crunched on the earth as I crossed to the door and pulled the heavy bolt. I heaved the door wide and the storm lunged inside. A blast of wind and water and biting cold air slammed into me, and with it a woman stumbled forward, collapsing onto the hay-strewn floor. She was trembling, a violent, bone-deep shudder, clutching her arms to her chest as if trying to hold herself together. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a fear so profound it stole my breath. It was a fear that went beyond the storm. "I can't make it any farther," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. Just, just let me sleep here, in the barn, until it breaks." I swallowed, my throat thick and dry. Words were strangers to me, especially words meant for a woman. For a split second, a hot wave of shame washed over me. 40 years old, and I'd never been this close to a woman who wasn't buying feed in town, never stood in the same small space, breathing the same air. But her shivering cut through my awkwardness. Without a second thought, I pulled my heavy wool coat from its peg by the door and draped it over her small, trembling shoulders. The worn fabric swallowed her whole. "You'll not sleep in the hay alone," I said, my voice low and gravelly from disuse, but steadier than I felt. My heart was thundering, a frantic drumbeat that echoed the storm outside. "There's room by the stove." Elias Red Feather used to say that sometimes the loneliest men don't seek the storm, but the storm comes for them anyway, carrying the one soul meant to break the silence forever. She stared up at me, her lips parted, her eyes searching my face for a trick, for a price. She found none. She gave a faint, exhausted nod, clutching the coat around her as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to tear her apart. Lightning flashed again, a long, lingering strobe that lit up the entire barn. And in its stark, unforgiving glow, I saw it. Not just the exhaustion, not just the fear. Around her throat, dark and ugly against her pale skin, were the faint but unmistakable marks of fingers. Bruises. This woman wasn't just running from the rain. She was running from a monster. And that monster, I realized with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty, was probably still out there, somewhere in the storm. Her hands shook so violently the tin cup rattled against her teeth as she drank. I'd filled it with water from the pump, my own hands clumsy and thick. She sat on a low bench near the old iron stove, its warmth slowly chasing the deathly chill from her soaked clothes. I tried to keep busy, to give her space, but the barn that had always felt like my kingdom now felt impossibly small. I stacked wood that was already stacked. I adjusted the lantern's flame, though it burned perfectly steady. 40 years, and I'd never shared this quiet with anyone. The weight of her presence was heavier than the roof holding back the storm. "You can rest here," I finally managed to say, my eyes fixed on the dirt floor. Looking at her felt like staring into the sun. She took a shaky breath. "I won't be any trouble. At first light, I'll be gone." The words hit me with a strange, unexpected ache, a sudden sharp fear that this fragile warmth, this break in the endless silence, would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. I finally found the courage to look at her. In the warm glow of the stove, I saw past the fear. I saw a fierce, stubborn weariness, the look of a fighter who had simply run out of ground to stand on. "Storm won't break by morning," I said, my voice a little softer this time. "And I've got more than enough room." Elias Red Feather's voice echoed in my memory, as clear as the crackle of the fire. It is a strange thing when two lonely souls collide. Stranger still when each sees their own ache mirrored in the other's eyes. She pulled my coat tighter around her shoulders, a fortress of wool against a world of hurt. Her body slumped as exhaustion finally won its battle, and she let herself lean back against the rough-hewn wall, her guard finally slipping. "I didn't mean to end up here," she murmured, almost to herself. I couldn't stay where I was." 100 questions burned on my tongue. Who was she? Where did she come from? Who put those marks on her neck? But I swallowed them all. Shame held them back. This wasn't my story to demand. Instead, I poked at the embers in the stove, sending a shower of sparks dancing into the air, as if the fire could ask the questions for me. She closed her eyes, and the lines of strain on her face seemed to soften just a little. In that shared silence, even the storm outside seemed to lose some of its rage. I sat down on the opposite bench, keeping a respectful distance. But my chest burned with a feeling I couldn't name. For the first time in my entire life, the quiet in my barn wasn't empty. It was shared, it was fragile, and it was terrifyingly alive. Then she flinched, not at the thunder, but at a sound from outside. The distinct, rhythmic sound of a horse's hooves, moving slowly, deliberately, getting closer. It wasn't a panicked sound, not a horse lost in the storm. It was the sound of a rider, a hunter, and my blood ran cold. Lightning cracked the sky, a deafening explosion so close it shook the very ground beneath the barn. The horses screamed, rearing in their stalls, their hooves pounding against the wood like war drums. I jumped to my feet, the bench I was on clattering against the wall. I rushed to the animals, my voice a low, steady rumble. "Easy now, easy," I murmured, my hand running down the quivering flank of my best mare. The woman shot upright, clutching my coat like a shield, raw fear flashing across her face as the lantern swung wildly from its hook. Another strike of lightning lit the rafters in a ghostly white, and a loose board high above rattled. Rain suddenly blasted through the new crack, a cold spray soaking the hay. But her fear wasn't for the storm. Her eyes were locked on the barn door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The sound of the approaching horse had stopped. Someone was out there, right outside the door. Without a word, she scrambled to her feet and rushed to my side, her skirts dragging through the damp dirt. She laid a hand on the trembling mare's neck. The animal snorted, stamping its foot, but under her touch a strange calm seemed to settle over it. It was as if the horse recognized a kindred spirit, another soul beaten by a storm. I glanced at her, stunned. The chaos of the thunder, the fear of the visitor outside, it all fell away for a second. There was only the sight of her, hair plastered to her face, her breath coming fast as she soothed the frightened animal. "You've done this before," I said, my voice louder now, trying to cover the sound of my own hammering heart. She gave a shaky laugh, a sound that was brief and bitter. Where I come from, storms were the only constant. You learn to calm what you can, even if it's not yourself. Then her eyes darted back to the door, wide with terror. "He's here," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He found me." My chest seized. He, the man who left bruises on her throat. The monster she was running from was right outside my barn. Elias Red Feather used to say that when two wounded lives meet in the middle of a fury, the storm itself becomes their witness, binding them stronger than stillness ever could. In that moment, her fear became my fear. Her fight became my fight. I grabbed my hammer from the wall and a spare board, shoving nails into my mouth. "Get away from the door," I hissed, scrambling up the ladder into the rafters to fix the leak. It was an excuse, a reason to move, to think, to prepare. From above, I could see her pressing herself into the shadows between the stalls, trying to become invisible. The lantern's glow cast her as a small, golden figure against a world of darkness, a world that was about to come pounding on my door again. The hammer felt heavy in my hand. It was a tool for building, for mending. But tonight I wondered if it would have to be a weapon. The pounding on the door began. Not the frantic plea of a victim, but the hard, demanding slam of an owner. The voice that boomed through the wood was deep and laced with an authority that expected to be obeyed. "I know she's in there, old man. I tracked her to this forgotten patch of dirt. Send her out now, and I'll forget I ever saw you." I froze in the rafters, hammer in hand, my heart a cold stone in my chest. Below, I saw her shrink further into the shadows, her face a mask of pure terror. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was petrified. This wasn't a lover's quarrel. This was a predator hunting its prey. The man outside wasn't just angry. He was dangerous. I scrambled back down the ladder, my mind racing. My whole life had been about avoidance, avoiding trouble, avoiding connection, avoiding the fight. Now trouble had kicked down my door and was standing in the rain, demanding I hand over the only bit of warmth that had entered my life in 40 years. "There's no one here but me and my animals," I shouted back, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "You're spooking my horses. Move on before the storm gets worse." A cruel, humorless laugh answered me. "Don't play dumb with me, hermit. I saw the light. I know my property when I see it. She's wearing a blue calico dress, torn at the hem. Now open this door before I decide to open it for you." He knew what she was wearing. My blood ran cold. He'd been close, so close. I looked at her, huddled in the dark. She was shaking her head frantically, silent tears streaming down her face. My coat, my big rough wool coat, was hiding the blue dress. A small mercy, but it wouldn't be enough. He was going to break the door down. I knew it. And what then? I was a rancher, not a fighter. My hands were built for mending fences, not breaking bones. Elias Red Feather's voice whispered in my mind, a cold, hard truth. There are storms made of water, and storms made of men, and often the second are the ones that drive us farthest from home. This woman had run from her storm, and it had followed her right to my doorstep. Now its rain was about to fall on me. "I'm giving you to the count of 3, old man," the voice roared, followed by a loud, splintering crack as he threw his shoulder against the door. The old wood groaned, the bolt straining. 1. I looked around the barn, my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude. It was filled with tools. A pitchfork leaned against the wall. An axe was wedged in a chopping block. Ropes hung from pegs. My mind, which for 40 years had only thought of seasons and livestock, was now a frantic catalogue of weapons. 2. Another slam, harder this time. A hinge screamed in protest. I met her eyes across the barn. In them I saw a plea, not just for help, but for a choice. And in that split second I made one. My 40 years of silence, of running, of being the town joke, it was all over. I would not let this man drag her back into the storm. I picked up the heavy iron skillet from the top of the stove. It felt solid, real. 3. The door crashed inward, torn from its hinges, and a massive figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the flashing lightning. He was even bigger than he sounded, a mountain of a man dripping with rain and rage. His eyes, cold and merciless, swept the barn before landing on me. "Where is she?" he snarled, taking a step inside, his hand resting on the handle of a pistol tucked into his belt. The storm raged behind him, a fitting backdrop to the violence he carried with him. My knuckles were white around the handle of the skillet. My life of quiet was over. The real storm was here. The man, Silas, stepped into the barn, the broken door swinging crazily on one hinge behind him. He was a giant, his shadow thrown long and menacing by the swaying lantern. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat, and his eyes, like chips of ice, scanned the dark corners of my world. "I'm not a patient man," he growled, his gaze sweeping past me, searching. His hand never left the pistol at his belt. "She belongs to me, my wife, my property. You've got no right to shelter what's mine." My throat was so dry I couldn't speak. I just stood there, the iron skillet feeling flimsy and ridiculous in my hand. Wife. The word was a slap in the face. This wasn't a stranger chasing her. This was her husband, the man who was supposed to protect her, the man who bruised her throat. My gut twisted with a rage I hadn't felt in decades. "She's not here," I lied, my voice a croak. Silas let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "Is that her, then?" he asked, nodding his head towards the corner where my heavy coat lay draped over a pile of hay sacks. It was a decoy, something she'd thrown there when he first started pounding on the door. But it was all he needed. He started walking towards it, his boots making heavy, determined thuds on the dirt floor. Every step he took felt like a drum beat, counting down the last seconds of my life. I had to do something. I couldn't let him get to the back of the barn where she was truly hiding, pressed into the narrow space behind the water trough. I said, "She's not here," I repeated, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. It was the bravest, stupidest thing I'd ever done. He stopped, turning his full attention to me for the first time. He looked me up and down, a sneer twisting his lips. "And who are you to tell me anything? The town ghost? I've heard about you. The man who's scared of his own shadow. 40 years old and never even touched a woman." He spat on the floor. "You think you can stand between me and my wife? You're pathetic." His words were poison, aimed at every insecurity, every lonely fear I'd ever had. The old shame burned in my cheeks. But then I looked past him, into the deep shadows, and I thought of her, trembling, listening to this monster tear me apart. Her fear was greater than my shame. Elias Redfeather used to say, "A man is not measured by the silence he keeps, but by the moment he chooses to break it." "Get out of my barn," I said, my voice quiet but with a new hardness in it, a hardness that surprised even me. Silas laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "Your barn?" He took another step, towering over me. "This is about to be the place you die." He shoved me hard. I stumbled backwards, tripping over a loose board and crashing to the floor. The skillet flew from my hand, clattering uselessly into a corner. He loomed over me, a cruel smile on his face, and drew the pistol from his belt. "Now, for the last time," he said, cocking the hammer, the sound echoing in the terrified silence. "Where is she?" And from the shadows behind him, a voice, small but clear, cut through the tension. "I'm right here." She stepped out from behind the stalls, my coat clutched around her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a defiant fire. She had seen him pull the gun. She was sacrificing herself to save me. In that moment, all the years of my solitude, of my cowardice, boiled over into a single clarifying thought. No, not again. I would not stand by and watch someone else get hurt. As Silas turned, his eyes locking on her with a triumphant glare, I scrambled on the floor, my hand closing around the first thing it touched. Not a weapon, a tool, a heavy-duty branding iron left to cool by the stove. It was thick, solid, and still faintly warm. "Come here, Clara," Silas ordered, his voice sickeningly sweet, the gun still in his hand but pointed loosely at the floor. "It's time to go home. The hermit and I were just having a misunderstanding." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. That was all I needed. As he took a step towards her, his back partially to me, I surged to my feet. I swung the heavy branding iron with all the force I could muster. All the frustration of 40 lonely years, all the rage at this bully, all the desperate need to protect the one good thing that had ever stumbled into my life. It was all in that swing. The iron connected with the back of his head with a sickening thud. Silas grunted, a sound of pained surprise. He staggered forward, dropping the gun, his hands flying to his head. He wasn't down. He was stunned, furious, turning slowly to face me, his eyes filled with a murderous light. You're dead," he growled, lunging for me. But I was already moving. I wasn't a fighter, but this was my barn. I knew every shadow, every loose floorboard, every piece of equipment, and I was going to use all of it to survive the night. Silas lunged, a wounded bull roaring with fury. I dodged to the side, and he stumbled past me, his momentum carrying him into a pile of empty feed sacks. I didn't wait. I scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The branding iron was gone, knocked from my hand in the chaos. I was weaponless again, trapped in the rafters of my own barn. "You can't hide from me, you coward!" Silas bellowed from below, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. I heard him kicking things over, the sounds of splintering wood and clanging metal. He was a force of pure destruction. "When I get my hands on you and then on her, you'll both beg for a quick end." I crawled on my belly across the rough wooden planks of the loft, trying to stay silent. Below, the lantern cast swaying, distorted shadows. I could see Clara pressing herself against the far wall, her eyes wide with terror, as Silas stalked the barn floor. He picked up the pistol he'd dropped, his movements clumsy from the blow to his head, but he had it. He was armed again. My mind raced, searching for an advantage, for any hope. This was my home turf. I knew its secrets. I looked at the massive hay bale hanging from the main beam, held by a thick rope and a pulley system I used to get feed down for the animals. The release knot was just a few feet away from me, tied securely to a post. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form in my mind. Elias Redfeather once told me, "The clever rabbit doesn't fight the wolf. He uses the wolf's own weight against him." "I know you're up there," Silas shouted, and then the creaking began. He was climbing the ladder. My time was running out. I had to draw him to the right spot. I crawled to the edge of the loft, right above the spot where the horses were stabled, and deliberately kicked a loose piece of wood. It clattered to the floor below. "There you are," he snarled. I heard him reach the top of the ladder and step onto the loft. His heavy footsteps shook the entire structure. He was coming for me, a monster in the dark. I held my breath, my hand hovering over the release knot. I needed him to be directly under the bale. Come out, wherever you are," he taunted, his voice getting closer. The floorboards creaked under his weight. I could see his silhouette now, a hulking shape moving through the darkness of the loft. He was right underneath the beam. It was now or never. "Hey, Silas," I yelled. My voice cracked, but it was loud enough. He turned toward the sound of my voice, a look of murderous triumph on his face as he raised the pistol. "Got you," he growled. But I was already pulling the knot. The rope went slack with a loud snap. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning shriek of stressed wood and rope, the half-ton bale of hay dropped from the rafters. It didn't fall fast, but it was an unstoppable force. Silas looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief, a curse dying on his lips. He tried to dive out of the way, but he was too slow, too big. The massive bale crashed down on top of him, pinning him to the floor of the loft with an earth-shaking thud. A cloud of dust and hay exploded into the air. The pistol flew from his hand, skittering across the wooden planks before falling through a gap and landing in the soft hay of a stall below. He was trapped, crushed under the weight of 1,000 pounds of animal feed. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't going anywhere. A series of agonized, muffled roars came from under the bale. The fight was over. I lay there, my body trembling with adrenaline, my lungs burning. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of the horses and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I had won. The ghost of the plains had fought the storm, and against all odds, he had won. I looked down from the loft. Clara was staring up at me, her face streaked with tears, her expression a mixture of terror, relief, and something else, something I had never seen directed at me before. Awe. Silence descended on the barn, thick and heavy, broken only by the muffled groans of Silas pinned beneath the hay bale and the soft, steady drip of rain from the eaves. The storm outside had finally begun to exhaust itself. I climbed down the ladder, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fell. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. Clara rushed to me, her eyes searching my face. Are you all right?" she whispered, her hand hovering in the air as if she wanted to touch me but wasn't sure how. I just nodded, unable to find my voice. We stood there for a long moment, the two of us, survivors in the wreckage of my quiet life. The barn was a mess. The door was broken, tools were scattered, and a giant lay crushed in my hayloft. But we were alive. We were safe. She finally let out a long, shuddering breath and collapsed against me, her arms wrapping around my waist, her face buried in my chest. She sobbed, not from fear anymore, but from a release so profound it shook her entire body. All I could do was stand there, stiff and awkward, before my own arms, as if with a mind of their own, came up and held her. It was the first time in my life I had held another person. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. He said you were a coward," she sobbed into my shirt. "He was wrong. You're the bravest man I've ever met." Her words were a balm on 40 years of wounds, the town jokes, the whispers, the lonely nights. They all seemed to fade away in the warmth of her embrace. I wasn't the town ghost anymore. I was the man who faced the storm. Elias Redfeather's words came back to me, not as a memory, but as a living truth. Sometimes love begins not with a grand vow, but with the smallest gesture that proves a soul is not alone in the world. Giving her my coat was a start. Holding her now, this felt like the whole story. We had a problem, though. A big one. Silas was still alive upstairs, and when morning came, the world would come calling. We couldn't just leave him there. We needed a plan. I looked at Clara, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the gentle lantern light. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a fierce, determined strength. "He has a ledger," she said suddenly, her voice low and urgent. "In his saddlebag. That's why I ran. It's proof. Proof of everything. The land he stole, the men he cheated, the bribes he paid to the sheriff. It's all in there. That's why he couldn't let me go. It wasn't about me. It was about the book. A twist. This was never just about a battered wife. This was about power, corruption, and a secret that could bring down the most powerful man in the county. Silas hadn't just been hunting his wife. He'd been hunting the evidence that could destroy him. And now that evidence was on a horse somewhere just outside my barn. The stakes had just gotten infinitely higher. We weren't just fighting for our lives anymore. We were fighting for justice. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, painting pale stripes across the dirt floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and quiet. It was a fragile peace, one I knew wouldn't last. Silas was still trapped in the hayloft, his occasional groans a grim reminder of the violence of the night. "I have to get it," Clara said, her voice firm. She pulled away from me, her resolve hardening her face. "The ledger. It's the only way to make sure he can never hurt anyone again." "No," I said instantly. "It's too dangerous. His horse could be spooked, or he might not have been alone." "He's always alone," she countered, a bitter edge to her voice. "Men like Silas don't have friends. They have followers, and they're all scared of him. He wouldn't have brought anyone. He was too arrogant to think he'd need help dealing with a lone woman and a hermit." She was right. His arrogance had been his downfall. "I'll go," I said. It wasn't a question. "You stay here, bar what's left of the door. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you ride my mare and you don't look back. You ride for the next town, for the federal marshals. You hear me?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a trust that humbled me. She nodded, her hand gripping my arm. "Be careful, Jedediah," she whispered, using my name for the first time. It sounded strange and wonderful on her lips. I slipped out of the barn, the cool, clean air a shock after the stuffy warmth inside. The world was awash in the soft colors of morning. A bird chirped somewhere nearby. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this peaceful scene had been a theater of war. Silas's horse was right where he'd left it, tied to a fence post, calmly chewing on some wet grass. It was a magnificent black stallion, a creature of power and pride, much like its owner. The saddlebags were thick leather, and my hands trembled as I unbuckled the straps on the right side. Inside, beneath a coil of rope and a small bag of coins, was a book, a simple, leather-bound ledger. I opened it. The pages were filled with names, dates, and figures, all written in Silas's sharp, aggressive handwriting. It was exactly what Clara had said, a detailed account of a life built on crime and cruelty. This book wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon. The weapon that would finally end his reign of terror. Clutching the ledger to my chest, I turned to head back to the barn, and that's when I saw him. Leaning against a tree at the edge of my property, a rifle held loosely in his arms, was a man. He wasn't one of Silas's men. I recognized him. It was Deputy Miller, the sheriff's man, and he was watching me with a look that was not friendly at all. He hadn't been with Silas. He'd been waiting, watching. My blood ran cold. The bribes, the ledger. It all clicked into place. The sheriff was in Silas's pocket. Miller wasn't here to help. He was here as insurance. He was here to clean up the mess. And I was standing in the open, holding the one thing that could expose them all. Deputy Miller didn't raise his rifle. He just smiled, a cold, lazy smile. "Morning, Jedediah," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Looks like you had a busy night. Silas get a little too rough with his missus again?" He knew. He knew all about it. He'd probably been turning a blind eye for years. The sheriff's going to want to hear all about this unfortunate accident. "But first," he said, pushing himself off the tree and taking a slow step forward, "I'm going to need you to hand over that book." I was caught, trapped between a corrupt lawman and a barn holding a monster. I had one chance. I looked at the deputy, then at Silas's powerful black stallion, its reins still tied to the fence. An idea, wild and reckless, sparked in my mind. Elias Redfeather always said, "When the wolves surround you, don't run. Create a stampede." I didn't answer Miller. I didn't even look at him again. I turned, stuffing the ledger deep inside my shirt, and ran. Not toward the barn, but toward the horse. Miller shouted my name, a note of surprise in his voice. I reached the stallion, my fingers fumbling with the knot on the reins. The horse shied, its eyes rolling. "Easy, boy, easy," I murmured, the same words I'd used to calm my own horses just hours before. The knot came free. I grabbed a handful of mane, leaped onto the stallion's bare back, and kicked its sides with all my strength. A shot rang out, the crack of the rifle echoing across the plains. The bullet whizzed past my ear, so close I felt its heat. But we were already moving. The stallion, a creature born of speed and power, exploded into a gallop, tearing across the wet field. I wasn't just running from the deputy. I was riding toward the town, toward the telegraph office, toward the only real law in this territory. I held on for dear life, the wind whipping at my face, the stolen ledger a hard, square promise against my chest. I had Clara's freedom and the justice of an entire county riding with me. The ghost was done hiding. It was time for him to raise hell. The ride to town was a blur of wind, mud, and thundering hooves. Silas's stallion was a force of nature, eating up the miles with a relentless, powerful stride. I didn't dare look back. I just leaned low over the horse's neck, the ledger a solid weight against my ribs, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every sound, every snap of a twig, felt like another gunshot from Miller's rifle. I burst into the town of redemption, like a man possessed. People scattered as the massive black stallion clattered down the main street. I hauled back on the reins in front of the one place that mattered, the telegraph office. I slid off the horse, my legs nearly buckling under me, and stumbled inside. Old man Hemlock, the telegraph operator, looked up from his desk, his eyes wide with shock behind his spectacles. "Jedediah? What in God's name?" "Get me the U.S. Marshals in Cheyenne," I gasped, leaning on the counter, my chest heaving. Tell them I have evidence. Evidence that will convict Silas Croft and Sheriff Miller for conspiracy, theft, and attempted murder." Hemlock's jaw dropped. Silas Croft was the untouchable king of this county, and Sheriff Miller was his loyal dog. Accusing them was a death sentence. He stared at me, then at the wild look in my eyes, and he must have seen the truth. He nodded slowly, his hands already moving toward the telegraph key. As the first clicks and beeps of the message began to fill the small room, I felt the first glimmer of hope, but I knew it wasn't over. Miller would be right behind me. I had to get back to Clara. I had to protect her until the marshals arrived. I ran out of the office, mounted the still panting stallion, and raced back the way I came. I prayed I wasn't too late. When I reached the ranch, the scene was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I slid off the horse, my heart pounding, and crept toward the barn, my hand gripping the handle of a rusty hay hook I'd grabbed from the side of the building. The main door was still broken, hanging open like a gaping wound. I slipped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. Clara was there, standing by the stove. But she wasn't alone. Deputy Miller had her, one arm clamped around her throat, the barrel of his rifle pressed against her temple. His face was pale with rage. "You should have just given me the book, Jedediah," he hissed. "Now she has to pay for your mistake. Drop the hook and give me the ledger. Now." My blood turned to ice. I had led him right to her. My stupid, reckless plan had put her in more danger than ever. I held up my hands slowly, the hay hook clattering to the ground. "Let her go, Miller," I said, my voice a low plea. "This is between you and me." "There is no you and me," he sneered. "There's just the ledger. Give it." I slowly reached into my shirt and pulled out the book. I held it out to him. This was it, the final choice. Her life for the truth. Elias Redfeather's final lesson echoed in my soul. True courage is not winning the fight. It is knowing what you are willing to lose. "Here," I said, tossing the ledger onto the dirt floor between us. "Take it." Just let her go. Miller's eyes darted to the book, his greed and desperation warring with his caution. For a split second, his grip on Clara loosened, his attention diverted. It was the only opening I would get. In that instant, Clara did something I never expected. She stomped down, hard, on Miller's foot with the heel of her boot. He yelled in pain, his arm flinching, and in that same moment she threw her head back, smashing it into his nose. He staggered back, releasing her, blood pouring from his face. Clara scrambled away, toward me. Miller raised his rifle, his face a mask of fury, and aimed it right at her. There was no time to think. I dove forward, tackling Clara, pushing her to the ground and covering her body with my own as the rifle fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in my left shoulder. I cried out, the force of the impact rolling me off of her. I lay on the ground, my shoulder on fire, looking up just in time to see something fall from the hayloft. It wasn't a hay bale this time. It was a man, Silas. He had managed to wriggle free while Miller was gone. He dropped down right behind the stunned deputy, a piece of thick rope in his hands. Before Miller could even turn around, Silas had the rope around his neck, pulling it tight with a savage roar. "You were supposed to be watching," Silas bellowed, his voice raw with rage and pain from his injuries. "You were supposed to make sure she didn't get away." Miller clawed at the rope, his face turning a dark purple, his rifle clattering to the floor. The two villains, the monster and his keeper, were locked in a desperate, deadly struggle. It was chaos, and it was our chance. I pushed myself up, my left arm useless, and grabbed Clara's hand. "Run," I grunted, pulling her toward the back of the barn, toward a small escape door I'd built for emergencies. We burst out into the bright morning sun, not daring to look back at the sounds of the fight raging within the barn. We just ran, hand in hand, across the open field, away from the darkness, away from the storm. We didn't stop until we heard the sound of approaching horses. It was a posse, but not Miller's. These men wore the silver stars of U.S. Marshals. Old Man Hemlock's message had gotten through. The 40 years of silence were over. My life of solitude was a memory. Standing there under the wide open sky, with Clara's hand in mine and the law riding to our rescue, I knew the storm had finally, truly broken. My shoulder throbbed with a pain that was real and clean, a pain I had earned protecting someone else. And as I looked at Clara, her face full of hope, and a future I never thought I'd have, I realized I wouldn't trade that pain for anything. The marshals took Silas and Miller into custody, finding them battered and broken, having nearly killed each other in their final, desperate moments. The ledger told the rest of the story, and the town of Redemption was finally given a chance to heal from the poison that had infected it for so long. Clara stayed. She never left. The barn was repaired, the door rehung, stronger than before. The quiet returned to my ranch, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with shared work, soft laughter, and the steady presence of another heartbeat next to my own. My 40 years of solitude hadn't been a waste. They had been a long, cold winter, preparing me for the warmth of a single, life-changing spring. I had waited a lifetime for the storm, and it had brought me everything. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of justice and redemption. And let me know in the comments, if 40 years of silence was broken by a single storm, would you have been brave enough to let love in?